Okay, here we are with George H., which is my great, I guess, grant sponsor. And we have the privilege of having George here. We are out on a retreat, a family sponsorship retreat. And George agreed to come out and tell us a little bit about the story of Narcotics Anonymous in South America and throughout also all over Latin America, how it started, and tell us a little bit of the story from his perspective. George worked for the WSO, World Service Office, for many years, along with Jimmy Kay, and he really was in the forefront of developing Narcotics Anonymous, or helping from the World Service Office perspective of getting literature out there, start to get literature printed in Spanish and Portuguese. And so George, thank you for being here, and for, you're always willing to share, and I know your passion for Narcotics Anonymous. Let us know, some interesting stuff from the beginnings of NA throughout Latin America.
See if I can remember them all, because they were all memorable. We started getting letters in the office in the early 80s, 1980s, from Brazil, Colombia, Panama, and Argentina were the ones that I remember, and some from Puerto Rico we had gotten in. And we were seeing that there was a desire to start a fellowship to help addicts, but it wasn't cohesive. You could tell by the pamphlets that they developed and these books that they had printed that they weren't cohesive at all with how NA in the United States was interpreting the program. And we believed that we needed to go down there and help them get through the translation of literature and give them our experience about Narcotics Anonymous and what it meant to us in English, so it could be translated into their own language. So about 1987, I received a letter from Constanza in Brazil asking us to come down and visit. And since I had kind of a passion for Latin America, having grown up in Miami, and with the Latin population in Miami, I kind of had a soft heart for it. So we went down there, and that first trip, there was 3 of us. It was myself, Chris, and George from Portugal. We all went down there. George flew over from Lisbon, he and his wife, Maria, and met us in Rio de Janeiro. And George had already been working on a Portuguese translation in Portugal, so he knew the types of things that we needed to get across in translating literature from one language into another, and some of the delicacies that we had in translating a message from one language to the other. And George was very instrumental in helping us do that. So we flew down to Rio, and we got in, and Constanza met us, and we did the usual tourist stuff. Constanza took us all around, and we went to see the Cristo and everything. And we enjoyed the hospitality of the Brazilians. We met for the first time in Campinas. And it was basically a Catholic retreat center in a small town way out of reach of the cities. I guess Campinas was a small city of about 50,000.
Yeah.
And it was a farming area.
I believe there was an American priest out there, which I got a copy from the World Service Office of a letter that they sent. I believe was Father Harold. He sent a letter to World Service Office, asking. And now that you're saying that you went down to Campinas, it makes sense. The stories match, so that's interesting.
And what they would do, the way that addicts were treated then was they would go to the farm and stay on the farm for about 2 years with no contact with the outside world. And no meat, no dairy products, they had a very strict diet. And we looked at ourselves and said we would never be able to get clean hair. And we found out that the Brazilians were also trying to get a translation thing going, so we encouraged them to do so. And in doing so, it brought out issues of class in Brazil, between the middle class and the lower class, and the language that was used in a fellowship called Toxicomanos Anonymous,
Mm-hmm.
and the new Narcotics Anonymous. It was just beginning in Brazil, and Constanza was trying to get NA started and connect with it worldwide. And Toxicomanos Anonymous was headed by a young man, I can't remember his name now, but he was adamant that the street addicts from Brazil be included, and the different language that was used in TA and NA.
Right.
It was very different. So that was the first big struggle that I remember in Brazil. And then we had to come back a year later.
And this is what, 1987?
87. Yeah.
Okay.
And I believe it was in 88 we came back with, I went down with Becky, who's now the
Yes, I believe.
assistant
Yeah, I met her.
director in the NA World Service Office.
I think that's Dora's.
It's Dora's
Sponsor.
sponsor, yeah.
Yeah.
And I met Dora on that first trip too, because she was friends with this young man who was, fighting for the street act was what he had in mind. And he was afraid that they would get lost in the class struggle, for the right recovery program. And we went down, came back a year later in 88, and we helped them get through some of the problems with translation, especially when it came to the types of drugs that were used, and actually Toxicomanos Anonymous had a whole different language in terms of recovery than the NA folks were using. So somehow we had to get them together so that they could blend the efforts that were being made for addict recovery program to use the strength of both groups to come together, and that's what we did in encouraging them to work together to come up with something that was acceptable to all. And we had very long meetings and discussing this and stuff, and it wasn't without strong passion from both sides. And I believe we were very successful in doing that, because when I came back the next time, things were together. NA had grown quite a bit and was growing now. They had language, the IPs in their language, and really began to take off. And they had worked out the problems with the language and agreed upon one translation. And that was a major accomplishment for them, major. And we cut tape for a minute.
Yeah. Okay, so here we're back. We're gonna continue our
Strong
interview,
history.
or through down memory lane and the history of NA.
So we went back to the World Service Office with new information about the growth there, and we're supporting them any way we could by providing free literature and whatever other services we could, help them coordinate communication with other communities in Latin America. Because after we went to Brazil, we also went to Argentina.
Right.
Went down to Argentina and met that fellowship for the first time, and they were eager to talk about all the things that were going on, and they were trying to start an office, which was probably the worst thing they could have done. They needed to build a service structure first, but they learned a lesson the hard way. They opened an office and hired a special worker who really was not taking authority from anybody. They had not set up a hierarchy in how they would deal with this special worker.
And let me ask you a question. During this time, where was the World Service Office located?
When we first went down there, it was located in Van Nuys.
In Van Nuys, California.
And then we moved to Chatsworth because we needed bigger facilities.
That's where it's still there today.
Yeah, because we rented a building that was way too big for us at the time, but gave us room to grow.
And let me ask you this: was I'm not sure what year did Jimmy Kay passed away? Where was he?
Jimmy passed away in '85.
Okay, so that was just pre. He had left the work, so you guys could. I know it was it wasn't only him. It was a group of brave men and women that.
But Jimmy was a contact point.
Yeah.
You know, he was the one that would come into the office and gather up the volunteers who would send out the literature or try to answer any of the letters that came in. And by the time I got to the WSO in '86, there had accumulated quite a bit of communication from Latin America that had not been responded to.
Mm.
And
For how long? What years were you at the WSO?
I was at the WSO beginning in 1986 till 2000.
Okay.
And
Wow.
yeah. And it was, we continued to correspond with the members in Latin America, both from Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, because the Colombians had also, about the same time, started a fellowship that they called NA2.
Okay.
And they called it Narcóticos Anónimos.
Okay.
They had developed a book, a little pamphlet, talking about NA in Spanish. And at the same time, one gentleman moved from Colombia to Panama, and the Panamanians developed another book, translated into Spanish. And there were two books that were very different in how they approached recovery and what they actually said. And you could tell with the lack of experience in recovery that they didn't quite get the lingo right.
Right.
And understand what we were talking about, and carrying the message.
So there was a lot of passion, a lot of willingness, but not much organization. I mean, as far as the structural service.
In Latin America, it was almost, the first thing to do was to start an office. That was the thinking before we got there. Because having an office in Latin America meant that we have credibility in the community. So almost every community in Latin America went to start an office first, which was a bad way to start because you sucked in all of the available resources in terms of people into the office rather than the service structure. And there was always the relationship between the office and the service structure was always a bit iffy. Nobody knew really how to handle the office and how to deal with an incorporated entity in their community. And they were so new that they really didn't know how to operate. And that's what we went down to Colombia to try and help them develop a structure so that they could, because they had begun, much like Brazil, in two big cities in the country. They had two strong fellowships in these major cities in the country, and then maybe some outlying groups that were trying to grow and get together. And
what were those cities? I know in Brazil was São Paulo and Rio.
Yeah, and in Colombia it was
Bogota?
No, not Bogota.
No, Bogota?
No,
Medellin?
Medellin and Cali.
Cali,
Yeah.
okay.
And at the same time, Ecuador, which is neighbor to Columbia,
Right.
he almost considered them the same,
Okay.
you know, because they would go to each other
Yeah,
and
support each other, yeah.
Yeah, and Panama was growing a community separate from all of that, even though it had some of the same members from one community to another. And because of the lack of experience, you began to see a lot of trouble in the fact that members did not understand the 12 steps. There were members in Colombia who believed that if you were a homosexual, that was a defect of character.
Okay,
And it was part of the problem because the literature was not read in the meetings, which gives you an idea about NA as a whole, and it speaks with a powerful force of we. And in these countries, and Brazil and Colombia were pretty much the same. You know, secretaries of the group had more power than practically any other member. You know, they determined who your sponsor was, who got to speak in the meetings. You know, you had to be in close with that secretary if you wanted to participate in that meeting.
and have been to Brazil, you know, and I'm originally from there. There's still meetings where, you know, it's accepted, the secretary, picks who's going to speak. And yeah, I think that's just the way, it's not everywhere, but, I think each place, I've been to meetings all over the world, they develop their own traditions. But I can see in the beginning, without guidance, how things are all over the place, the egos and, without traditions and.
Yeah, and the loudest voice usually won. They were the ones who dominated the community until we explained to them that it's not about an individual's interpretation. It's about the fellowship's interpretation.
Yeah.
And that we needed to be clear that this message